So you want to incorporate an offshore company to reduce taxes, get some asset protection, or maybe you just want more privacy. And if so, good. Offshore companies can help you with all of these goals. But there is a huge mistake that people keep making when it comes to incorporating offshore, and I want to help you avoid it. And that mistake is incorporating in the wrong country. So here's what I'm going to do. First, I'm going to share the 3 reasons a country lands on our bad list. Second, I'm going to name and shame 5 countries that you should not use when incorporating offshore. And lastly, I'm going to give you 5 alternatives that you might want to consider instead. Because here at GlobalBanks, we've seen every offshore company imaginable, and we know the challenges that each of these offshore companies face when it comes time to open a bank account. And that's what I'm going to focus on in this video, helping you avoid 5 offshore companies that are extremely hard, even impossible, to bank. But first, here are the 3 reasons that countries end up on our bad list. And reason number 1 is that the country of incorporation is blacklisted or even graylisted by certain governments or quasi-government agencies. I'm talking about lists like the FATF list, or even the EU, UK, or OFAC lists. But it's not just government agencies that are clamping down on different countries. Banks have their own internal blacklists of countries that they refuse to bank, and countries can land on these lists for lots of different reasons. It can be as basic as a country not complying with treaties, information sharing agreements, or even tax standards. Or it could be because the country has a higher level of risk in terms of money laundering, terrorism financing, corruption, or some other risk factors. And if the country where you incorporated is on one of these lists, your company is going to struggle to open bank accounts, because these blacklists are very difficult to overcome when it comes to banking. I'm going to share a few examples of these blacklisted countries in a second, but first I do want to wrap up the other 2 reasons you should avoid certain countries. And the 3rd reason I'm about to share is probably the most overlooked reason out there that no one else thinks about when it comes to structuring offshore. But first, let's talk about reason number 2, which is that the country of incorporation is extremely obscure. I'm talking about rarely used countries from a structuring perspective. And basically, bankers have never been asked to open accounts for a company from this country before. While this might not seem like a big deal, if you approach a bank with a corporate structure that they've never seen or heard of before, it's going to raise a lot of questions, especially if you don't live in that country. And that's the perfect formula for getting your application rejected immediately. Not because the bank can't open your account, but because it's going to be too time-consuming and not profitable enough for the bank to even try. And if you're lucky enough to get a banker who's willing to share a bit of advice, they might even tell you to go and structure in one of the 5 countries that I'm going to share with you in a minute. Now, the 3rd and final reason that a country can land on this list is probably the most common one that we see. And it's that the country has a poor reputation in the banking world. Now, reputation can be shaped by both real concerns or perceived concerns. And a lot of the time, it comes down to how the country is being portrayed by international media, correspondent banks, and even foreign governments. And I just want to be clear, I'm not talking about any kind of formal blacklisting or graylisting. I'm just referring to informal red flags that make banks question your country of incorporation. And before you shrug this off, I want to share something that could really change the way that you look at banking, which is that your company is not entitled to open a bank account. Banks can choose if they want to open an account for your company or not. It's that simple. And if you choose to incorporate a company in a country that banks aren't comfortable with, you're going to struggle to open accounts. It's just a fact. That's why I'm going to share 5 other options that you might want to be considering instead when it comes time to incorporation. So you can reduce taxes, unlock asset protection, or just get more privacy while still being able to open bank accounts. But first, as promised, I am going to be sharing 5 places to avoid when incorporating offshore, including 3 common structures that we do see people using regularly. Now, 2 quick points before we start naming and shaming. First, we're only talking about the country of incorporation. So we're not looking at the challenges related to business activities or other compliance issues. But these other issues, these other factors, they obviously matter as well and will impact whether or not your company can open a bank account. And the second point that I want to share is that even though these countries of incorporation are on our bad list, it doesn't mean they're completely useless. In a lot of cases, companies from these countries, they still offer value to the right person when used for holding specific assets, obtaining various licenses, or unlocking certain treaty benefits. But if you do use these countries to incorporate, regardless of your reasons, you're going to struggle to open bank accounts. Now, let's take a look at the first of the 5 countries that you should avoid. Seychelles. Now, Seychelles has been used for incorporating offshore since the mid-90s. That's when the International Business Companies Act was first introduced here. Basically, it was a cheap alternative to BVI, Cayman, and the Bahamas, and it offered protections through strong secrecy laws for beneficial owners. But unlike these other countries, companies formed in Seychelles struggle to open bank accounts. There's a couple reasons for this, and while most people put it down to banks just being more risk averse and not wanting to onboard offshore companies at all, it's deeper than that. You see, even though Seychelles isn't blacklisted by the EU, it still doesn't comply with their international tax standards. And the only reason that Seychelles is not blacklisted is because they've technically committed to reforms. Now, the issue that the EU has with Seychelles is the same issue that banks are going to have, which is that Seychelles is generally non-compliant when it comes to regulatory requirements. And on top of that, it has a bit of a reputation. Think scandals, jumping on and off various blacklists. Basically, it's a cheap place to set up a company, and it has a reputation of being used by bad actors. So if you're serious about going offshore and you need access to good international banking options, you probably want to consider avoiding Seychelles companies. And actually, most people do. Because while we do see the odd Seychelles company, they're not nearly as popular as companies from the second and fifth country that I'm going to be sharing with you in this video. But before I share these other countries, I do have a serious question for you. Do you like this kind of video where I talk about the challenges that companies from different countries can face? Yes, no, maybe. If you do like this approach, can you do me a favor? Hit the like button, because that tells us that you like this style of video and we should keep making more of them. And if you have any specific countries that you want me to cover from an incorporation perspective, drop a comment and the name of the company or structure that you want me to cover below. And then we'll make videos for the ones that get the most comments. Okay, now back to the countries of incorporation to avoid from a banking perspective. And the next one is Panama. Now, I should point out that we view Panama as a good jurisdiction for personal residency. And if you're looking for offshore banking with a low deposit, remote opening, and USD banking, it's an interesting option to consider as well. In fact, if you haven't watched my recent video on banking in Panama, you should probably give that a watch as well, because there's a few major changes that might make you want to consider banking there. But there is a big secret about Panama banks. And I haven't heard anyone else say this before. It's that most Panama banks don't want to bank Panama offshore companies owned by foreign non-residents. See, the banks in Panama, they've had to deal with a lot of scrutiny since the Panama Papers. You might even say they have PTSD. Basically, they don't want the extra compliance headaches that come with helping you open bank accounts for an offshore corp with basically zero local substance as a foreign non-resident. Instead, the vast majority of Panama banks, they only want to deal with local companies, with local operators and local employees. But listen, it is possible to open accounts for Panama offshore companies in Panama, but it's usually when these entities are being used for wealth management purposes. As for banking outside of Panama, it's extremely rare to find options for Panama companies, though certain high deposit options do exist in different banking jurisdictions. And that's the reason Panamanian companies are on this list, because they have so few banking options available to them, especially at reasonable deposit levels when compared to many other offshore structures like the 5 that I'm going to share at the end of the video. But in short, we like Panama for residency and we think it's a good entry point into the world of offshore banking for certain people. But if you're looking at it for structuring or wealth management, or you're coming in with higher deposits, there are usually better options available elsewhere. Now, I'm going to switch gears a bit. I want to look at an old favorite of the offshore world, Anguilla. Now, Anguilla is in the Caribbean. It's in the same neighborhood as BVI and St. Kitts and Nevis, which are popular offshore structuring hubs. But there's a big difference when it comes to incorporating in Anguilla compared to these other options. And it's that BVI and Nevis companies don't struggle nearly as much to open bank accounts, at least not if you approach the right bank and have the right deposit. But Anguillan companies do struggle to open accounts. And the reason for this difference is pretty simple. Anguilla is flagged by the EU as a non-cooperative jurisdiction for tax purposes. And the reason that Anguilla is flagged boils down to allowing operating companies without any real economic substance. Now, in the banking world, this is a red flag. And that's because banks need to know where your company is operating from. Plus, Anguilla has issues with its reputation when it comes to record keeping. Basically, the sense is that Anguilla doesn't enforce any standards, and there's no requirement for retaining financial records or underlying documents for any of the companies that are incorporated there. And in case you're not aware, banks favor jurisdictions with strong transparency. So if a country doesn't enforce record keeping and it doesn't have a great reputation to start with, it's going to be an issue, making it much harder to get an account approved. So if easy banking is a priority, this is another one you should avoid. Though it's probably not nearly as bad as this next option, which you can find in West Africa, Liberia. Now, Liberia has had its uses in the past, And in certain instances, it is still used effectively, especially in the marine space, for ship registration through a Liberian Foreign Maritime Entity or FME. But if you're thinking of a Liberian corporation or LLC as the linchpin of your offshore holding structure, you need to think again. And that's because Liberia is the capital of red flags. I'm talking about outdated reputation management, insufficient regulatory and compliance updates, a lack of transparency, high risk designation, and it's also considered a flag of convenience. And all of this basically puts every banker in the world on super high alert. These are not the optics that you want when trying to convince a bank, or anyone else for that matter, that your structure is above board. And for that reason, banks don't want to touch Liberian companies, at least not anymore. Basically, if you think a Panama company is hard to bank, a Liberian corp is nearly impossible. So if you're serious about offshore structuring that works, structuring that actually gets banked, then you need to consider somewhere else. And before we cover the 5 places you might want to consider instead, we still have one last country we're going to cover. And this is a place that a lot of people consider for offshore structuring. But before I share this final country, if you haven't already, please hit the like button and subscribe for our future videos, because we've got a lot of great videos coming up that are going to completely change the way that you think about banking and the choices that you make when it comes to going offshore. Okay, so the final country of incorporation that we're going to discuss is Belize. Now, I have talked about Belize before, though it was from a banking perspective. And when it comes to banking, Belize is not a good option for most people, unless you actually plan on spending a lot of time in the country. And it's not due to any fault of the country or even the banks. It's because Belize doesn't have suitable correspondence to support cross-border banking. I'll be doing a dedicated video on banking in Belize soon, so if you're interested in this topic, make sure you subscribe so you know when we publish that video. But as far as incorporation is concerned, Belize companies tick a lot of the boxes people look for when going offshore. They're exempt from local taxes, there's no public disclosure of owners and directors, there's no requirement to file financial statements, you can use nominees, and Belize has strong asset protection laws. And on top of all of that, Belize companies are super cheap to set up and maintain, but maybe a bit too cheap. You see, when people come to us with a Belize company, it usually indicates that they're early on in their offshore journey, not very well versed in the available options, and maybe they're looking for budget solutions, instead of going with tried and tested options like a BVI Corp. But the real issue when it comes to banking a Belize company is the lack of transparency and the reputation associated with them. Basically, Belize companies were being used to set up anonymous entities. And while you can't access full anonymity in Belize anymore, it's still significantly more private than many other countries and doesn't give anyone access to the beneficial registry. And all of that spells trouble when it comes time to open bank accounts with reputable banks in solid jurisdictions. So, let's talk about what you should do instead. Or rather, where should you incorporate offshore to make sure you get the most value in terms of access to banks, payment processors, and all of those benefits that you were looking for that made you want to go offshore in the first place. And as promised, I am going to be sharing 5 of the best places to incorporate offshore from a banking perspective. But first, since you made it this far in the video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe so you get alerted when we publish our next videos. And speaking of next videos, instead of just jamming the 5 jurisdictions that you should consider instead when going offshore into the end of this one, I decided to publish this video right here, where I share all 5 of the alternative options you might want to consider, breaking down the types of banks that they can access, the benefits that they can offer, the types of individuals that should consider using these entities, and I even explain why our favorite country for structuring offshore is